Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, fueling philanthropic programs and dedicated to creating educational and professional opportunities for Alaska Native people.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 13th of April, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date on your local weather information. You can do that very easily by going to weather.gov/Alaska or finding us at the Weather Info line at 800-472-0391. During the day, you'll find interesting information on NWS Alaska's Facebook page. You'll get river watch pictures there, updates about the aurora or record high temperatures. Also find that information on Twitter. And you can always find anything that we're talking about weather using the hashtag AKwx. That means Alaska Weather, of course. And even if you're not friends with us on Facebook or on Twitter, that's a good way to join in on that conversation. On YouTube, you'll get your daily afternoon map briefing, and you can find kind of a sneak peek at what we'll talk about here during Alaska Weather at around 4 o'clock or so on NWS Anchorage's YouTube channel. So be sure and check that out. Here's a quick look at what's going on right now across the North Coast. Blizzard warnings are back for the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, as well as the northeastern Brooks Range and the coastal plain there. Wind gusts will likely come up to about 40, maybe even 50 miles per hour. And as we've been talking about for the better part of the last week or so, it's not really going to be a very snowy situation, but a lot of it is going to be blowing around. And as those gusts could remain strong, visibility could drop down to dangerous levels if you're trying to move about. So definitely be careful. Make sure you have a plan and make sure that anybody that you're around knows that you're traveling, leaving, and when to expect you back, just in case someone has to go out looking for you carefully there. Winter weather advisory is posted from Point Barrow down the coast toward Wainwright and Point Hope, and also for the northwestern, eastern, and northern slopes of the Brooks Range summits there. So be careful out across the west. Yellow is the winter weather advisory, and the red zones, of course, in the blizzard warning and through tonight and early tomorrow morning. Now that's winter weather. Of course, we are looking at spring-like changes across a large part of the state, and we've been talking about Alaska River Watch and spring flood potential for the last couple days. I'd like to welcome my friend Selena Van Breukelen. She's a hydrologist with the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, and she's going to walk us through a little bit about what we can expect for 2016's breakup across Alaska. Welcome, Selena.
Hi, Dave.
Hi. What are we looking at here? This is the spring flood potential across all of Alaska. Tell us about that.
Correct. So looking at our spring flood potential map, each of the villages that we monitor as far as spring breakup has a color code to it. You can see from the graphic that all the villages except for one have either a low or a moderately low chance of flooding. The one exception to that is going to be the Sag River at the Dalton Highway, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But how we come up with these flood potentials is we look at a number of factors. One of the things we look at is the number of times which they have flooded over the past 15 years. That's an indicator of just the local susceptibility of a particular village to flooding. We also examine the snowpack over the past winter and also the temperatures, both the observed and the forecast. The observed temperatures because they impact how the ice is formed over the winter, and also the forecast temperatures to have a greater understanding of how the snow is going to melt and how the ice is going to degrade. So I said before, the flood potential across the state is very, very low, which is fantastic for us to be able to report. The one exception to that is going to be the Dalton Highway at the Sag River. And the past 2 winters, the ice has formed a little bit differently on the Sag River. And so what has happened is as snowmelt happens, instead of the majority of the snowmelt going into the river, it's actually gone across the highway. DOT did a number of improvements over the summer to try to raise the roadbed, but that ice is still forming this winter, and so they're trying to do their best as far as mitigation efforts, but there still is that potential.
Okay, so with a combination of snowmelt across the state and the temperatures and all that put together, this is kind of the general consensus below average for most parts of southern and southeastern Alaska, and maybe closer to normal for many other parts of the central and western parts of the state.
Correct.
Okay. Now, if we look around the state with webcams, and this is one of our favorites, we can see how the ice has changed and how it looks now, how it looks last year. Tell us about what we're looking at here.
Right, so this is a photograph from the Nenana Ice Classic. The image on the right are the conditions today, and what we brought it up is we tried to compare it to last year's. And so looking at or last year's at the same time. So looking at the two side by side, that we can see that last year at this time, the ice looked a lot stronger. There's a lot more snow still present on the hillside. I mean, really the difference is that last year it looked like winter, whereas this right now it looks like it's farther into breakup. It seems like we're several weeks ahead of where we typically are.
Okay, so a lot of ice, similar conditions around the state look like what we're seeing there at Nenana.
Correct.
Okay, very good. And snowpack is very important to your prognosis for where rivers are going in the next several weeks there. What are we looking at here for snowpack?
Right, so this is a map of the snow water equivalent. It's published by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so hydrologists care about the snowpack just to understand the amount of water that's held in the snowpack in a watershed. Just from the very simple equation, if there's more water in the watershed, you're going to have a higher likelihood of flooding or more severe flooding. So what we get out of this is we can see that most of South Central has a below normal snowpack. Looking up towards the Fairbanks area and also like the northern and the eastern interior, that section of the state is much closer to normal up towards the Porcupine watershed. And then looking on the north slope and also the western interior and sort of the middle Yukon, that snowpack is a little bit below normal.
Okay, it's always good to point out that what we're seeing here around Anchorage or maybe even into the Susitna Valley isn't exactly the same story that we're seeing around the rest of the state.
Right.
Okay, so that's snowpack, but as we all know, it's been a pretty warm winter, and the expectations are that that could continue?
Exactly. So this is the temperature forecast over the next 2 weeks, so for essentially the rest of April. And so what this is telling us is that these above average temperatures are forecast to continue. And so what that means from a breakup standpoint is that most likely breakups are going to continue to be earlier. It's going to help reduce our flood potential because what we're doing is we are just slowly bleeding off that snowpack and letting that in place ice degrade. So by the time that it finally moves out, it's probably pretty weak and is able to move out without causing issues.
Okay, so an average snowpack in the interior and above normal temperatures, that leads you to think this is going to be what you call a thermal breakup?
Correct. And so that's what I just described. It's where the ice is degraded in place before sort of the snow melt hits it.
Right.
And that, as far as minimizing flood potential, that's what we like to see. So we're predicting a thermal breakup.
Okay.
Our climatologist was saying before that if there was ever a year to predict breaking breakup records,
Right.
as far as making breakup come earlier, this would be it.
Okay. Now, as far as any trouble spots go around the state, just because we're having what looks to be an early breakup, a thermal breakup, maybe lower amounts of snow, and so lower flow through some of the rivers there, does that mean that all the villages and all the trouble spots are going to be A-OK this season, or should we still be on the lookout for that?
We really need to always be on the watch for those sorts of things. One of the dangers with a thermal breakup is that because there's not as much snow melt in the river, that the water levels are lower, and so ice chunks and ice pans can tend to get hung on gravel bars or on shallower sections of the river that it wouldn't have had we had a little bit more water in the system. These tend to lead towards sort of minor or moderate ice jams, so it's still important to be aware of these.
Okay, so right now most places are looking pretty good, but the one that has your attention is the Sag River at this point.
Correct.
Okay. Now, in just the next week or so, I would imagine, River Watch is getting started. Tell us about what River Watch is again, and then how people can stay in touch with you.
Right. So River Watch is a joint venture between the state of Alaska and the hydrologists at the River Forecast Center. They'll be flying on the Yukon River and also on the Kuskokwim River, probably starting within the next 2 weeks. And so what they'll be doing is they'll be flying the river, they'll be landing in villages, and they'll be trying to tell people about what's happening as far as river conditions, letting them know and warning them about any sort of flood potential. So feel free to contact them when they're visiting your village. Also, a great way to contact us is you can give us a call with any sort of observation or get a hold of us via Twitter or Facebook.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Selena. I've enjoyed, just in the last couple of days, reminding myself about what River Watch is and seeing the pictures that are just now starting to come in. We shared one of those last night or along the upper Kuskokwim yesterday. So just wonderful ability to see all of the changes around Alaska and one of the greatest efforts from the National Weather Service in Alaska this time every year with Alaska River Watch. So thanks so much for joining us and guiding us through the outlook there. Any questions that people have, you can certainly post them on Facebook and we'll try and get those answered. And of course, call in your observations and send us pictures there to the web address and the email on your screen. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Selena. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Let's get back into the current Alaska weather now, and as you can see with the satellite picture, our overall weather picture really hasn't changed very much in the last couple of days. We have a pretty broad or diffuse area of low pressure that's coming in from the west, and it's spreading that moisture out quite a bit across the coast. And a little bit more of an organized surge coming in from the western Gulf of Alaska. With that southeasterly wind's been picking up across the Alaska Peninsula, but by the time any of that reaches into the interior, things are really drying up. One thing did catch my eye, though. If you look out across the central and eastern sections of the Yukon Territory, earlier today, clouds were building up there along an axis of low pressure, and we're not going to be able to actually plot that lightning strike. But I promise you, if you were watching the monitors in my office today, thunderstorms started popping up right here, and a couple strikes were developing. It is getting to that time of the year that we are watching for the thunderstorm activity there. So kind of some of the first little signs of that type of weather pattern development there across the interior of Canada, and well, probably not too long before some of that starts moving our way, but not in the forecast today. However, things are dry across the Yukon Valley and out across the west, and of course across the North Slope we're still looking at high pressure across the Arctic Ocean, guiding in those stronger and northeasterly winds through the coastal plain, and especially along the coast. There are gale warnings out for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea, and of course blizzard warnings for those same areas on land, and out to the west, winter weather advisories where poor visibility remains a possibility through tonight and early tomorrow. Now, out across the west, we still have northerlies coming down the Bering Sea. That's all wrapping into low pressure south of the central Aleutians at 985 millibars. Here's our weak, kind of lingering area of low pressure across the Gulf. Not a whole lot associated with that. And then just to the south, another wave of low pressure there south of Haida Gwaii. It's been sloshing up moisture there into places like Craig and Klawock and Ketchikan and Annette. Some light rainfall there and some showers in Prince William Sound. Overall, though, the last couple days, precipitation across the entire region has really trended down, so some big changes there. As we get into tonight, dry conditions across the north. Wind will be the main factor across the north, probably the biggest issue we have in the state tonight. Showers of rain and snow across Prince William Sound, not so much around Cook Inlet, and then out across the central and eastern Aleutians at 988 millibars. We have our front trying to work its way north, and it's not going to happen. It's going to drop southward back into the Gulf of Alaska and really start to fall apart as we get into Thursday. The moisture with this is somewhat sparse, and as it moves up across the outer coast of southeast, we should expect showers in the same old usual places there. It will start to move back into Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, King Salmon, and Dillingham, all the way back toward Nikolsky, and maybe as far west as Atka, but even that should be fairly light, and mainly rain and snow mixed all the way up toward the Pribilovs, with clouds lingering across most of the Bering. But that should start to break up too as we get into Friday. Notice we have a ridge of high pressure right here, so things should stabilize. Wouldn't be surprised to see some fog under that, of course, but with northerlies moving out of the Bering Strait and down the western coast, things should remain dry, but a little bit on the cooler side if you're on the coastal villages. For the Alaska Peninsula all the way out towards Sand Point and eastward, a better chance for light rainfall into Kodiak Island and Prince William Sound. But really things are fairly dry up and down the Yukon, the Kuskokwim, and then north of the Brooks Range. You're still going to be dealing with some wind as we get through Friday and into Saturday. Here's a look at temperatures today. Another warm one and another record high set in Anchorage with temperatures back in the mid-50s, 40s and 50s for all of southeast. Haines and Skagway both at 53 degrees today. Ketchikan, Craig, and Klawock all in the upper 40s and low 50s, 57 in Hyder. South Central saw temps anywhere from the low to mid-50s up and down Cook Inlet to the 40s around Prince William Sound. Cordova was at 51. Golcana 50 degrees, 45 in Fairbanks. And we saw the tripod there at Nenana, and no wonder the ice is riding out so quickly there with temperatures that have been well above freezing, not only during the day but even sometimes at night. So conditions like that continue to just be amazing, and certainly early this year. 32 in Eagle, 30 in Fort Yukon, looking northward across the Arctic coast. Teens, but even that is a little warm. 16 around Barrow, 15 for Kaktovik, into Kotzebue Sound, 20s and 30s there. Kivalina was 35 today. Shishmaref 30, 33 in Nome, 43 in Unalakleet. Galena was showing 38 around 3 o'clock. As we go down the river a little bit more, 34 in Amonuk. Aniak was 48 degrees, 52 in Bethel, and 42 in McGrath. Bristol Bay temps were in the 40s and 50s today. King Salmon at 57 degrees. Kodiak Island on either end close to 50 degrees. 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula. 37 in Dutch Harbor and St. Paul. And Shemya also showing 37 with Adak and Atka at 39 and 41 respectively. Overnight low temperatures then will stay above freezing for many in south central and Kodiak Island at 41 southeast in the mid to upper 30s. Fairbanks looking at 26, Fort Yukon 6 degrees, 0 in Barrow, and teens for Kotzebue Sound. Nome expecting 26, Bethel 31, Bristol Bay in the mid-30s, and the central and eastern Aleutians back in the mid-30s with St. Paul at 33. High temperatures tomorrow there in the lower 40s with St. Paul at 35. St. Lawrence Island you'll see 22, 35 in Nome, 27 for Shishmaref, 10 around Barrow. Looking for temps as high as 50 tomorrow in Fairbanks. South Central back in the heat in the lower 50s, 46 in Kodiak and upper 40s, and easily lower 50s in Southeast. If you get a little more rainfall though, those temperatures will likely cool off a bit. Speaking of which, let's check on flying weather. Now tonight, don't be surprised if there's a pop-up shower or storm across the outer coast of Southeast. We've seen some of that activity here across the central Yukon, but as far as any organized big convection goes across Alaska, we're just not seeing that yet. Probably have to wait a few more weeks. IFR conditions are expected in the morning from the Pribilofs north and west down into the central chain and then generally south of the Alaska Peninsula and south of Kodiak Island, with MVFR to start across a large part of the central and western Alaska range and of course across the North Slope under blizzard and winter weather advisory conditions there. That will at least continue. Don't be surprised if it's IFR with stronger gusts up to 50 miles per hour. From AKwx eastward into the central Gulf, IFR conditions are expected there. You'll see some of that improving for MVFR across the central chain and across Prince William Sound. MVFR eases up off the central and western parts of the Alaska range, and then IFR is lingering but moves westward of the Pribilofs and the central chain out in the Bering Sea there for the afternoon tomorrow. Here's your pass conditions then. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass both expected to be VFR throughout your Thursday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass we expect to see MVFR conditions there. Rainy Pass should see improvements during the days we just saw on the map. Windy Pass also expected to see visual flight rule as we get into the afternoon. Isabel Pass should see some gradual improvements there, but probably starting at MVFR. And Mentasta Pass, we likely start out at MVFR, some low clouds in the morning, and then back to VFR conditions there. Tanita Pass also expecting to see VFR throughout the end of the day. Portage Pass will linger at MVFR through most of the day there, with showers at least in the vicinity of the eastern entrance. And Chilkoot and White Pass look like a pretty nice day. VFR conditions expected. Here's freezing levels now, and you'll notice that 2,000-foot freezing line's on the move back north again up toward about Amonic and southward towards Sand Point. The surface freezing line is kind of getting nudged southward a little bit more with that high pressure system up north working in tandem with low pressure working just south of the Aleutian chain. So a little bit of colder air is dropping southward. Not a whole lot of change across south central or southeast. The 4,000-foot freezing line south of Sitka to about Craig and Klawock there, around 4,000 feet tomorrow morning. Icing potential is pretty hit and miss. There's really not anything organized except for the band of moisture we have from St. Paul out toward Adak and Atka and then over AKwx and the Alaska Peninsula generally. Most of that will be above 4,000 feet, and we've got some hit and miss areas of moisture that could reach isolated moderate at best, and then also across the middle Yukon Valley above 4,000 feet for your daytime tomorrow. The jet stream shows our super highway of weather is really in the same old place from the Kamchatka Peninsula to well south of the Gulf of Alaska with wind speeds as high as 185 knots, and most of that then is recurving back into the Pacific Northwest. One thing that's interesting, and it's always good to watch, are these little fast-moving areas of wind on and surrounding the circulations of low pressure. There's some of those that you call those jet streaks, and sometimes they can reinvigorate the weather at the surface there. And you know, in a thunderstorm situation, if we were able to see those kind of match up with a lot of moisture and instability, that would probably get showers and storms going, but we're just not quite there yet this part of the season. Here's 9,000 feet. Winds are pretty light across the Susitna Valley, across the YK Delta, across southeast, the Copper River Valley, and south and southwesterly winds develop across southeastern Alaska at 9,000 feet. Once again, our strongest winds, of course, right where you'd expect, with blizzard warnings intact, 20 to 30 miles an hour for knots from the east and northeast across the Brooks Range and the coastal plain. As we get down to 3,000 feet, you can see our broad northerly flow really cutting into the central and western Aleutians around 30 to 40 knots or so. Two circulations evident here in the Gulf and south of the Alaska Peninsula, with broad easterlies sweeping offshore about 15 to 35 knots, and winds are fairly light over the interior here at 10 knots or so, 30 knots just outside of Prince William Sound, and a gentle south and southwest breeze blowing in at around 30 to 35 knots over southeastern Alaska. Here's a look at your turbulence potential then. Anywhere below about 4,000 feet up north, should expect some isolated chops, and some of that reaching isolated moderate perhaps, especially across the north coast. Now, a lot of that could just be low-level wind shear, and on top of that, you're not going to be able to see very well with blowing and drifting snow, so take it easy flying up north tomorrow. Around Kotzebue Sound and then along the Yukon Valley, we should expect some isolated areas of turbulence throughout the day. With low pressure just south of the Aleutians, we should expect some occasional moderate across the central and western chain, most of that again below 4,000 feet. And watch for some isolated turbulence with the circulation just outside of the Dixon entrance, below about 4,000 feet there. Again, that could reach isolated moderate. Let's look at your aviation forecast. We're going to go right on into sea surface temperatures and the sea ice outlook. Here's a look at the sea surface temperatures from yesterday. And we're still tracking that warm water that's moved up across the Gulf. And a lot of this is running a little bit warmer than normal at this point. But one thing to note is that there is no longer sea ice inside of Cook Inlet as far as we can analyze or see with web cameras or high-resolution satellite pictures. So as of today, our sea ice analysts are telling us that Cook Inlet is now sea ice free for the season. Out across the west, the water temperatures in the Bering and the Arctic Ocean, of course, are still cold enough to support that ice. And here's what we get. There is still plenty of ice out there. The white areas, of course, are ice concentrations of 80% or higher. The blue areas, 80% or lower. And we still have many areas that are in the process of opening up, but we also have a lot of areas that are already open up. And many areas in Norton Sound, just offshore of Nome and all the way into the eastern Norton Sound region are wide open. Take, for example, around Shaktoolik and west and south. You can see for a long way that there's a lot of open water there. One thing to stress about this, one thing that's very important for you and your village, is that the ice conditions are becoming dangerous across many of the coastal areas. The shore-fast ice in some cases is not so fast anymore, and a lot of that is rotting fairly quickly. So ice conditions are changing and water is opening up. So make sure you know where you're going and what you're getting into before you get out on it there. And you can always check the latest weather conditions and certainly the ice conditions at our website at weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. And you'll find maps like this that allow you to check on the concentrations, but also check on the thickness, which is really important this time of the year, as well as sea surface temperatures there, so you can make a better and more informed decision to keep you and yours safe if you're going out anywhere close to the ice, or certainly even further than that. Now, let's get into the specifics there for southeast. North and easterly winds will be moving across the Lynn Canal tomorrow. Very light, 10 knots, 2-foot seas there, and southeasterlies across the Dixon entrance and the Clarence Strait. Look for 15 knots with a 3-foot sea there. Across the outer coast, 15 knots to about 20 knots as you head further north. Seas ranging from about 9 to 11 feet. By Friday, winds are picking up a little bit more. The direction doesn't change all that much on the outside, still holding from the south and southeast. In the Lynn Canal, you'll see winds come back around to the south, 15 knots with a 3-foot sea, and south and southeasterly winds across the central and southern parts of southeast, with winds as high as 25 knots with a 5-foot sea. Across Cook Inlet tomorrow, northeasterlies coming down about 15 knots. West of the Barrens is as high as 25 knots. In Shelikof Strait, you're looking at 30 knots with a 9-foot sea over places like Raspberry Island. 20 knots from the east on the eastern side of Kodiak Island. 6-foot seas there, and across the north and western Gulf, similar conditions should be expected. Prince William Sound, a light northeasterly flow will pick up a little bit more from the east tomorrow on Friday. With 15 knots with a 3-foot sea, and winds go light, if not variable, on the eastern side of Kodiak Island, and fairly light inside of Shelikof Strait, 10 knots there with a 3-foot sea. North and easterly winds will continue coming down Cook Inlet, but pick up a few more to about 20 to 25, seas ranging from 4 to 8 feet, 6 to 7-foot seas in the north and western Gulf. For the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay, we see seas running around 7 to 11 feet across the Pacific coast, and 5 to 6-foot seas across the Bering. 5-foot seas inside of Bristol Bay with a northeasterly flow up to 25 knots and 20 knots from the north by Friday. Light and variable winds south of Kodiak Island with northerlies from Sand Point to King Cove and False Pass. And on the Bering Sea coast, those seas could be as high as 8 feet with that northwesterly flow coming in at 25 knots. For the Aleutians, northwesterly winds all the way from Atka to Adak and out to Shemya, 20 to 30 knots there with 11 to as high as 15-foot seas on the Pacific side. North and easterly winds wrapping into low pressure that's moving toward the Gulf at 20 to 30 knots. Look for seas ranging from 15 to 17 feet on Thursday, becoming 10 to 13 feet on Friday. Winds will shift around to more of a southeasterly direction from Kiska to Attu, and that could bring winds up to 30 knots there with an 8-foot sea. And northwesterlies for the central and eastern chain, ranging from about 25 to 30 knots, seas holding at 10 to 11 feet there on Friday. Northerlies coming over St. Lawrence Island are still passing over the ice, but north of Nunivak Island, seas are up to 2 feet now with that northerly flow. Northeasterlies coming out of the Kuskokwim Delta at 25 knots are expected to come up to about 6 feet there for the seas, 8 feet around St. Paul and St. George on that northeasterly flow. And northerlies over St. Matthew could be around 20 knots on Thursday, switching to more of a northwesterly flow and 15 knots on Friday. Look for northerlies over St. Lawrence Island at 25 knots. Outside of the Kuskokwim Delta, northerlies at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. And expect northwesterly winds over the Pribilofs with an 8-foot sea on Friday. Now remember, our winds are still fairly strong across the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast by Thursday, and that could keep winds up to 30 to 35 knots for Thursday afternoon. And of course, our blizzard warnings are still intact, and winter weather advisories are expected for many areas in the west. That lasts at least through tonight and early tomorrow morning. Conditions are really not pointing on a whole lot of improvement as we go through Friday and into Saturday, so keep that in mind. For Kotzebue Sound, northeasterlies at 20 knots there are expected. For Friday, northerlies will switch around a little bit more. Otherwise, winds continue from the east in all areas at 25 to 30 knots and 35-knot winds there from Wainwright southward toward Cape Lisburne as winds switch around to more of a northeasterly direction on Friday. Recapping tonight's weather, high pressure is still in charge across the northern Yukon there, and the winds will stay up across the north coast. Look for blowing and drifting snow, and blizzard conditions will be possible with wind speeds there anywhere from 30 to 50 miles an hour with gustier conditions. Across the south and west, snow showers are possible around Nunivak Island and the southwestern coast. It's all wrapping around the drier north side, though, with low pressure south of the central and eastern chain. That's pushing a frontal boundary into the western Gulf. That will be dying out. Not a lot of moisture there across the north and eastern Gulf. Look at that will be drying out as we get into Thursday and into Friday. So the next several days, the focus for precipitation will mainly be across the north and western Gulf, moving slowly toward southeast. So as we get into Friday, look for areas of clouds across the interior, southwest, and the north, but most areas will be dry if you're away from the Gulf Coast. That's a look at your Alaska weather. Thanks for watching. See you again here tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Condor Airlines, offering non-stop service from Ted Stevens International Airport to Germany and beyond. Featuring refurbished cabins and new seats with individual entertainment systems available on all Condor long-haul flights. More information at condor.com. Condor, born to fly.